back in February, Elizabeth Bruenig wrote a article for The Atlantic that's called Why the Left Should Embrace Pronatalism. And in there, she defines pronatalism as the principle that having children is good and it should be promoted by society. And she talks about how in the politics of 2025, this view tends to be associated with the weirdest and creepiest people on the right wing. But she thinks that's a shame because the kind of economic policies, the kind of welfare state expansions that the left wants would in fact make it easier for people to have more kids. And this isn't the way she puts it, but it's the way I would put it. We should just take the W on that. Instead, a lot of people on the left end up being negatively polarized into not wanting to use that kind of messaging. And look, I get it. The way that right-wing pronatalists talk about this stuff really could not be stranger and more off-putting. Jake, I think we have the old clip of J.D. Vance talking about this on the Charlie Kirk show.
We need to reward the things that we think are good and punish the things that we think are bad. So you talk about tax policy. Let's tax the things that are bad and not tax the things that are good. If you're making $100,000, $400,000 a year, and you've got 3 kids, you should pay a different, lower tax rate than if you're making the same amount of money and you don't have any kids. It's that simple.
I totally agree.
Got that? The funny thing is that he's talking about something that's like not even an 80-20 kind of policy. I'm pretty sure this is like 95-5. Who has a problem with child tax credits? But when Vance frames it as using the tax code to, and I quote, reward people who have children and punish people who don't by making them pay more, my own visceral reaction is to find what he's talking about repulsive. I suspect that's most people's reaction. But I also think Bruenig is right about negative polarization and leftists not wanting to brand left politics as pro-natalist, as, in other words, as like, oh, this is good because it'll make it easier for people to have kids, which will be good for society, because they associate that with the right-wing stuff that's at best weird and creepy, and at worst might slide into genuinely bad and illiberal policies to try to pressure or shame people into having more kids. And I want to give you a couple of examples of people who've had exactly this reaction. Here, for example, is David Klion, who's a columnist for The Nation magazine and a contributing editor to the left-wing journal Jewish Currents. Klion says, I find the left natalism position baffling. Money is not the reason people don't have more kids. Consistently across cultures and economic systems, people with more money have fewer kids. The world's most generous welfare states have low birth rates. Most people want 2 kids max. And the next one, if you want above replacement birth rate, we know how to get there. Make people poor, deny women education, restrict personal freedom. The right considers that desirable. That's their agenda. But if you're a progressive, you might need to accept that this is not a progressive goal. Next. To be clear, I support a generous welfare state for families. I think parents, and more importantly, their kids, can use a lot more support. I'm just under no illusions will cause birth rates to skyrocket. It hasn't anywhere else. And then finally, if you want to give a national population to grow, the most obvious solution is immigration from poorer countries. Natalists who object to that make their actual priorities clear. In an ideal world where no country is that poor, maybe the human race will shrink, and maybe that's okay. And what I really want to point out here is 2 things, right? So, for the record, some of the big empirical claims that Klion is making here are just provably wrong. We'll circle back to that in a minute. But right now, I want to note the general shape of his position. He denies that making it financially easier for people to have kids will, in fact, lead to more people making this choice. And if that's not clear in his wording, go back and look at that thread and look at the replies to him and his replies to the replies. He explicitly believes that free daycare, financial support for parents, none of that stuff will move the needle in any noticeable way in the aggregate. He's very clear on that. He believes the only way to generate the result of more people having kids will be to do terrible, illiberal, reactionary, authoritarian things, which means that left-wing natalists must either be confused or they're in denial about reality, or he strongly insinuates without quite saying it, it's a smokescreen for people who might be left-coded in other ways, but actually secretly want to do bad, illiberal, reactionary, authoritarian things, just like the J.D. Vances of the world. And he actually supports all the same pro-kid economic policies that someone like Liz Bruenig wants, but he absolutely doesn't want to brand them as pro-kids. In other words, and this is me editorializing, he doesn't want to take the W. Similarly, there was an article responding to the Atlantic piece by friend of the show, Nathan Robinson, and I know usually when I say friend of the show, I'm being snotty, like when I say friend of the show, Jordan Peterson or whatever, but Nathan actually is a friend of the show and a friend of mine. I've stayed at the man's house. He's been a guest on GTAA numerous times in the past. We have him booked to come back in June to talk about his foreign policy book that he wrote with Noam Chomsky, and I'm quite sure he'll be a guest many times in the future. The article I'm about to talk about is not the first or 10th time that Nathan and I have disagreed with anything, but I obviously, think he's a good guy. And crucially for our purposes here, I think he's a smart guy, which means I think he's going to give you the best version of a position, even when he's wrong, which I think he is here. His response article in Current Affairs is called Why We Should Be Neither Anti-Natalist Nor Pro-Natalist, and it's exactly what it sounds like. He thinks as a matter of principle, the state should be totally neutral about what the birth rate is. We should just say as a matter of basic liberal pluralism that it's nobody's business. And as I said, he's a smart guy. He's going to follow the breadcrumbs of this line of thought to its logical conclusion. So he says, and I quote, if the human population shrinks over time, it is a matter of perfect indifference to me. I want the people who do exist in the future to be happy and to live well, but I have no opinion on how many people there ought to be. If in the long run our species goes extinct, I do not think this is a matter of moral concern. Let the manatees inherit the earth. This does not mean I think human beings are some kind of cancer on the planet, that we should go extinct. I think it means our job is to take care of people who happen to show up in the world, not to ensure that anyone does show up. Now, Nathan and I do have a really fundamental philosophical disagreement on this point. I'm sorry, but I do not want the manatees to inherit the earth. I don't have a problem with manatees. I'm sure they're lovely animals. I'm happy to share with them. But my boiling hot take is that all else being equal, the extinction of the human race would be a bad thing. And even short of that, part of providing a good life for people who do show up involves more people showing up later to take care of them as the first people age, which is one reason why people who raise the next generation aren't just doing something that might be good for them in terms of their own emotional fulfillment, but also doing something that's good for society. And again, like David Klion, Nathan doesn't actually disagree with the policy substance of anything Liz Bruenig wants. He's all for free daycare and financial support for parents and all of that good stuff. Like Klion, Nathan just doesn't want to argue for any of that on the grounds that it'll be good for society because it'll make it easier for people to choose to have kids. Again, in my view, he's right on the policy. But when it comes to the rhetoric, to how we promote that policy in the political war, Nathan just doesn't want to take the W. And at this point, in response to views like Nathan's and David Klion's, there's a really good intervention on the other end from the other Bruenig, or I'm sure lots of people have that surname, but the other Bruenig with the high profile on the left, someone who's been a multiple-time guest on this show also, Matt Bruenig. By the way, Liz, come on sometime. Matt has a blog post on this called the fertility question, where I think he has some really smart things to say about the basic shape of the debate. There's a part that comes early on that I think is really worth quoting at length because it's smart. Matt writes, what I find most interesting about the fertility issue are the philosophical tensions that it brings to the surface. The ideal scenario for fertility is that individuals have whatever number of children they wish to have, and this results in aggregate fertility that's not too high and not too low. When this state of affairs obtains, fertility is not a matter of public concern, not something that could ever plausibly be seen as a legitimate subject of politics or policymaking. People will have their own personal opinions about ideal family sizes for themselves and others, just as they have, he mentioned some other issues on other questions, but these remain personal opinions, not, something perhaps suited for lifestyle blogging, but not much else beyond that. What's so troubling about a scenario where there is too low overall fertility is that it confronts us with the reality that something we regard as a deeply personal and private matter is also, in the aggregate, very socially important. This observation is potentially destabilizing to liberal principles, personal autonomy, individual rights, and neutrality towards an acceptance of pluralistic conceptions of the good. Uh, if we acknowledge that aggregate fertility is a matter of social concern, then some might conclude that individual fertility is something society and the public should have a say in, which is, among other problems, repulsively illiberal and anti-feminist. And then he divides up the basic positions people take in this debate into 4 options. So the first, let's get the graphic up. He doesn't call it this. It's what I'm calling it. But the first option is the manatee option. Matt writes, for Robinson, the fact that the aggregate of individual fertility choices can have negative spillovers on the rest of society does not in any way challenge the conclusion that the society has no business concerning itself with aggregate fertility. And again, you can see why somebody would think that, because if society concerning itself with aggregate fertility means that it would have to concern itself with individual fertility, so it would be doing illiberal things to pressure or shame individuals into having kids, even if they think that's not the right option for them, that would obviously be bad. That's a point I'm pretty sure Nathan Robinson, David Klion, and both Bruenigs agree on. I certainly agree with it. The second option that Matt mentions is what I'm calling the nothing to see here option. That's the one that holds that actually, even if the aggregate birth rate was something society as a whole, could legitimately take an interest in, right now that aggregate birth rate is fine, so there's nothing to see here. And there are a few ways you could make that argument. You could point out that after all, the world population is much bigger than it was a couple hundred years ago, for example. Or you could even say, look, even if it's declined to below replacement levels in a bunch of advanced developed countries, there are all these countries in the global south where that hasn't happened. So if there's any concern about population numbers, to take care of the last generation in the West, the answer is letting in more immigrants. Now, personally, I'm all in favor of letting in more immigrants, but I don't think this is a particularly good answer to the more basic issue. Liz Bruenig mentions one reason why not in the original Atlantic article, which is that almost by definition, this is a stopgap. As immigrants come, they tend to assimilate over time and they adopt the family patterns of people who are already here. There's also a deeper question about okay, I'm pro-immigration, but I also think as a leftist that a lot of the reason so many people want to come to the US right now is because of massive injustices in the global distribution of wealth. And not for nothing, in a lot of places, the massive poverty and chaos and instability and violence that's caused by stuff like the United States propping up really brutal regimes in the global south. So presumably in a world where we got everything we wanted in terms of both domestic and foreign policy, sooner or later, the patterns of who wanted to move from which country to which other would stop being so lopsided. You'd stop having more people wanting to come from Latin America to the US and Canada than vice versa, for example. So just saying, as long as we have these massive global inequalities, we'll keep having lots of immigrants. So don't worry about the new generations of people who are already here, is a really weird fit with saying, let's fix those massive global inequalities. In fact, this whole question of birth rates and immigration is a perfect example of how the shape of social media-driven political discourse often means that people are much more concerned with owning their political enemies and showing that they're terrible hypocrites than in figuring out what they think and why they think it. Sure, if right-wingers say they're concerned about population, but they want to keep out immigrants, that combination of positions shows they're racist hypocrites. I agree. But what do we want? Do we want there to be those global inequalities and injustices that make immigration patterns so lopsided forever? And if that's not our position, then what is our position on the aggregate birth rate issue? Do we in fact want to leave the place to the manatees? So going back to the Bruenig piece, his third option is the one he calls the Handmaid's Tale option, which is the general option of saying, okay, society should interest itself in the aggregate birth rate, and therefore it should interest itself in the individual, fertility decisions, and it should do various kinds of reactionary and illiberal things to try to shame or pressure or prod or cajole people into having more kids. Again, that's repulsive and anti-feminist, and all sides of the intra-left debate would quite rightly reject it for that reason as a matter of course. Whether we're talking about just politicians doing culture war finger wagging about childless cat ladies or actual Handmaid's Tale stuff or anything between. Finally, and most interestingly, option 4 is to say, yes, society does have a legitimate interest in the aggregate birth rate, but it would be bad and illiberal for society to take the slightest interest one way or the other in whether any particular individual chooses to make that choice, and to do anything to pressure any particular individual into having a kid who doesn't want a kid, or having more kids if they don't want to have more kids, or whatever. Individuals should obviously be able to do whatever the hell they want without being pressured or finger wagged in any way. And that might seem like a cop-out or even a logical contradiction. How can you say both of these things at the same time? But Matt points out that there are lots of issues where we walk and chew bubblegum in exactly this way all the time. Nobody thinks anything of it. He points to the rural doctor shortage, for example. It's a problem for society if not enough people choose to become doctors, and it's a problem if not enough of the ones who do end up working in underserved rural areas. And so for exactly that reason, you try to come up with various policies to make it easier for people to become doctors and to provide benefits to tempt more doctors to practice in rural areas. We acknowledge that it would be bad and illiberal to pressure anyone to go to med school if they think law school or philosophy grad school or whatever is better for them. But we don't, we certainly don't scold or shame or finger wag doctors who choose to live and practice in cities. But we nevertheless acknowledge that the rural doctor shortage is the sort of aggregate issue it's legitimate for society to care about. As Matt says in his essay, trying to change the economics to provide more doctors to rural areas is in fact what we have done with initiatives like the National Health Service Corps that provide financial incentives for medical professionals to work in underserved areas. This type of thing is not understood by anyone as being repulsive or liberty destroying. And of course, he goes on to say, it's not a one-to-one. Obviously, decisions about family formation are much more private and intimate, and it would be that much more offensive to pressure any individuals into doing that than into becoming doctors or rural doctors. But on a sort of more fundamental point, you can see how we can take an interest in shifting the economics to change the aggregate without doing anything illiberal in the individual case, and how, again, nobody sees this as a problem in all these other areas, like the rural doctor shortage or, any number of other issues, whereas policy questions, you might try to get more people to make a decision by making it easier. And Matt writes, based on the above analysis, it is easy to see why the fertility issue is one that could favor the economic left. The most liberty-respecting policies that increase fertility are the left-wing ones that socialize the cost of children by enacting things like paid parental leave, a monthly cash benefit for kids, and free childcare, pre-K, education, and healthcare. These benefits also happen to be favored by the left for totally other reasons rooted in opposition to inequality and poverty. Indeed, there is such a consensus on the left in favor of the benefits that when people like Nathan Robinson go out of their way to explain that they philosophically reject the idea that fertility can ever be a matter of social concern, they still nevertheless feel the need to indicate that they support all these policies anyway. And he says, of the four types of responses identified above, it's ironically the pro-natalist right will you'll find the most hostility towards these proposals, not because they don't realize that they will, at least at the margins, increase fertility, but because for many of them, their commitment to market income distributions takes precedence over their pro-natalism. Pushing family benefits would thus have the added advantage of revealing how full of shit they really are. And that's great. And some people will say, oh, but actually the premise is wrong. After all, look at the Nordic countries that already have all these Bruenigs policies in place, and the birth rate still is an over-replacement. Or remember the claim in those David Klion tweets that in rich countries, people only want 2 children max. And so the only way to make them want more is to make them really poor. But it's actually very easy to show that empirically that's just nonsense. The New York Times ran a story in 2018 showing that actually if you ask all American women how many children they'd ideally like to have over the course of their life, their answer is average out to 2.7. That would be way over the replacement birth rate. And I guess it's possible there's been some dramatic cultural shift since 2018, but I don't think so. We can look at an actually really recent Gallup survey where they asked Americans the family size they think is ideal, and 44% say 2 kids, but 29% say 3 kids. And there are actually way more people who give numbers that are over 3 than there are who give numbers under 2. Now, maybe some of these respondents are very young and they're fooling themselves, and later they'll realize kids are a pain and they don't feel like it. Or maybe these are all hypocrites who like talking about how many kids they'd like other people to have, but they don't really want them themselves. But I don't think so, because you can also look at polling about people who have or expect to have fewer kids than they think is ideal. This is again from the New York Times, and you can check out their answers. And guess what, baby? It is all about economics. Here are the factors most commonly cited. Childcare is too expensive, 64%. Want more time for the children I have, 54%, which again has to do with how much people have to work because they're financially overstressed and precarious. Worried about the economy, 49%. Can't afford more children, 44%. Waited because of financial instability, 43%. Not enough paid family leave, 39%. No paid family leave, 38%. And it goes on like that. What about the argument that the birth rate is high in really poor countries and it's historically declined in rich ones, including the social democracies that already do all the Bruenigs things? Well, if we're going to have a serious conversation, let's have a serious conversation about these points, because I think a lot of people aren't thinking about them very hard. It's true that when poverty becomes really extreme and intergenerational, you go around the event horizon and people actually have more kids, especially if you're in a country where you don't have public programs to support people in their old age. So your best hope is the privatized retirement plan of your own kids taking care of you. But that's very, very obviously compatible with it being true that in the countries where lots of the population has enjoyed a halfway decent middle-class lifestyle, when the economics of that have become more strained and precarious and people are more financially stressed, they don't feel like they can afford to have kids, or people who have one kid. I was just in a long conversation last week with some members of my extended family in this situation. They have one kid, but they look at the astronomical cost they're already paying for daycare, food, clothes, all of it, and they just don't see how they can swing a second. And I'm not talking about people who, are desperate, right? These are people with good jobs, but even so. And the point about the Nordics is, I think, even more ridiculous for two reasons. First, saying, oh, the birth rate has declined in both the US and Sweden, therefore the kinds of differences in material conditions between the US and Sweden must be irrelevant, I think really misses the point by a mile. The global swing toward neoliberalism has had uneven effects around the world. You're still way better off being a Swede than an American as far as all that goes, but it has been global. Whether Swedes are in a less financially precarious position than Americans is 100% irrelevant. The question is whether Swedes in 2025 are in a less or more financially precarious position than their own parents or grandparents were 20 or 40 years ago. When people think about whether they can afford, by their standards, to have kids, they're never comparing themselves to prospective parents in other countries where people never had it as good anyway. They're always comparing themselves to their own parents. So that's one point. Second point, there's robust evidence that introducing these kinds of financial supports and social programs to help parents and kids has had a noticeable positive impact on aggregate birth rates in these countries, all else being equal. Empirically, Klion is just wrong about this. Maybe since all else is being equal, you would still get some decline. All else is not equal, right? Maybe you'd still get some decline regardless if you don't do bad illiberal things none of us are willing to do. That's an empirical question. If so, I agree, we'll just have to live with some decline. But certainly you'll get less decline, and that's going to be better for society. Not just in that it postpones the inheritance of the manatees, but that there are more people to take care of the aging. We can acknowledge that and promote lefty economic policies for that reason without budging an inch on liberal pluralism and the principle that everyone should make whatever family choices are best for them without any scolding or finger wagging. It should be no problem to walk and chew bubblegum on this question and to take the W on how the policies we want are objectively and obviously pro-family. And one last point, because I know Congressman Khanna is going to be joining us soon. Some people might just say, hey, why care about this at all at a time of rising right-wing authoritarianism? We have bigger things to worry about. Or even at a time of rising right-wing authoritarianism, isn't it bad to budge on even seeming to agree with the bad guys on any cultural point? And I actually think that's really backwards. Most normies think it's good to have kids, that promotion of this good is good. And at a time when the right is more authoritarian and dangerous than ever, when it's more important to defeat them than ever, why on earth would we cede this ground to them? Why should we let them pretend to be the ones who are in any way pro-family? We shouldn't. We should take the W. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron exclusive post games on Monday nights, all of the patron exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.